I'm going to go ahead and start. We have a fairly short session today and a lot of people with a lot of things to say. Hopefully you're familiar with Scholarly Kitchen. If not, we're a blog that publishes 5 days a week on, as our tagline says, what's hot and cooking in scholarly publishing. We're going to do a little bit of a discussion. I'm going to put one question to our bloggers across the board. You can see who they are and what they do up there. And then hopefully just turn it over. Hopefully it'll spur some thoughts for you guys, and you can ask questions, and we'll just turn it into a group discussion. About a year ago, as part of my job at Oxford University Press, I was asked to give a State of the Publishing Industry talk to our U.S. Research Society, our journal partners, our journal editors, being a fundamentally lazy person, I thought, this is great. Academia moves at such a slow pace. I'm going to be able to use this talk for years with little tiny tweaks to it. And then 6 months later, I was asked to give the same talk to our UK partners, and I had to rewrite about half of it. And so now it's 6 months later, and I'm rewriting the other half of it. I like to think of the period that we're in now as the Great Acceleration. We aren't really dealing with new issues. Archive has been around posting preprints since 1991. We've seen consolidation. I mean, Wiley merged with Blackwell more than 11 years ago. The open access movement has been with us since at least the year 2000. But sort of like every other aspect of our lives in this magical, wonderful, interconnected digital utopia in which we live, we've sort of reached this point where it feels like everything is happening at once. Every week there's another piece of crucial publishing infrastructure that is changing hands, or there's a new open access policy, or there's a new open letter petitioning for a change that you're expected to sign on to, or there's a new technology, a new standard that you absolutely must implement. The upside to all this accelerated pace is that it gets us closer to our goals faster. We know the field of scholarly communications is still far from perfect. We're still stuck in some ways in these traditional ways. People still love PDFs. But it's right now with these tools we have, it's so much easier, so much faster to hear from our authors, hear from our readers, hear from our library partners. It's so much easier to publicly discuss potential plans and hopefully put those plans into action. The downside of moving really fast is the faster you go, the less effective are your breaks. Scholarly communications, it's a complex ecosystem and one that, despite its problems, largely works pretty well for most of the participants. So deliberately disrupting one aspect of the ecosystem, one part of the chain may have unexpected consequences elsewhere. And by then it may be too late to stop things from unraveling. We know the idea that the sort of damage that the idea of move fast and break things, that philosophy from Facebook and others, the damage that it's really done to our society at large, is this what we want for academia as well? So with that in mind, I put the question to our chefs, our blog authors, not just what's happening right now that's important, but what's happening that's important and fast, and sort of framed in the question of what keeps you up at night. And it was interesting to hear their answers to that because a common theme sort of emerged from that, and it's this idea of trust and authority. There's so much going on in the world of scholarly communications, let alone the world at large, that we need trusted sources of information more than ever. At the same time, though, trust is eroding. Systems are being gamed, alternative facts, propaganda, all these things are being injected into our daily lives. The notion that everything should be free on the internet has devalued content of all types, so much so that a lot of the quality control processes that we use to vet information no longer seem to have the same impact. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to our chefs and ask them for their thoughts. I'm going to start with Alice Meadows. So your response to this question, what keeps you up at night, was a very big picture, this idea of erosion of trust in science and research in general. Can you talk about how you're seeing that and maybe what we should be doing that's different?
Sure. So yeah, I am going to, as David says, start with the big picture and the kind of, scary world that we live in. Slightly less scary today maybe than it was yesterday, but still, a kind of divided world that we live in really. And particularly, I think, worrying for all of us in this room and in the scholarly communications community more broadly is this persistent and in many cases deliberate, although in other cases kind of ignorant, erosion of trust in science and kind of questioning of science. Now, some of that is due to people not understanding how science works, and that's understandable because I'm not sure we do a terribly good job of educating people on that. But some of it is, a deliberate effort by certain politicians who will remain nameless to discredit science and to choose to ignore what scientists tell us they believe in favour of their own beliefs, which are perhaps not quite as valid. This does genuinely keep me up at night, but I think that although we can't necessarily solve the problems of the political world, we can and should, in our own ways, both at an individual and an organisational level, try to contribute to solving those issues within our community, and in doing so, make science and scholarship and research stronger and more credible, and then therefore less vulnerable to these attempts to discredit it. And to be fair, public trust in science overall remains very high, actually. There's a Pew survey from last year which showed that 72% of Americans, I shouldn't say 72% of Americans, 72% of respondents who from the US do still trust scientists, and a similar poll in the UK showed even higher number, 83%, whereas our politicians, surprise, surprise, are very much less trusted, around the sort of 17% in the UK and 26% here, I think it was. So, we scientists and we are very much more trusted. However, we as a community can be divided ourselves as well, and I think that's where we need to focus more on what we have in common and less on where our differences are. So, a lot of the rhetoric that we hear is, open versus subscription, librarians versus publishers. It's a kind of good, bad kind of debate. Open, we dichotomize ourselves, and I think we weaken ourselves by doing so. I think, having said that, there are some really nice examples of where this isn't the case, where we have chosen to focus on what we have in common. So organisations like mine, Orchid, was very much founded out of the community by a mix of commercial and not-for-profits, universities, publishers, vendors, funders. So that's a really nice example, and there are a number of others. And I honestly think if we could spend more of our time focusing on that, focusing on the 80% probably where we have things in common and we share the same goals, we could really do a huge amount to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
If that's not too grandiose.
No, that's good. Thanks, Alice. You mentioned this sort of animosity, libraries versus publishers, and that leads me into Letty Conrad. So Letty, your answer when I asked you was similar to Alice's, but you focused on this heightened animosity, sort of this idea of devaluing the role of academic publishers who, used to be seen as the guardians of the literature and now are often cast in the role of enemies of academia. So can you talk a little bit about that? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the things that are keeping me up at night are, as Alice put it, the divisiveness and the sort of animosity, if you will. The first sort of approach is the adversarial one rather than a collaborative one. And part of what has been troubling me specifically around this sort of vilification of publishers is the assumption that publishers are in this sort of monolithic space. I'm not denying that there isn't corruption out there, and there are ways that all of us can improve what we do. But this really hit home for me a couple of years ago when I began my doctoral work. I'm about 3 years now into a part-time doctorate in information science. And so I've now been in 3 sessions directed to doctoral students by our faculty around publishing. And my jaw hit the floor the first year. I was a bit more prepared the second year, and I did not attend all of the third year. And that is because the message that has come through those sessions, and I do think our faculty have been doing all of their best efforts to prepare and protect doctoral students in the publishing experience. But what I came away with was get ready, get your guard up, lots of horror stories, lots of worst case scenarios. And instead of instilling a sense of we're all in this community of scholarly knowledge and we all have more that unites us than divides us. What was sort of delivered to my cohort was a very adversarial approach to publishing, that doctoral students should get ready for a fight when they submit their article. And I just, not only do I find that completely unproductive, I think it ends up focusing our time and our energy in places where we're not going to get anywhere except further down our partisan holes. And so I would echo Alice's sort of call for each of us every day, the us and them, the publishers versus libraries, that group, that us-them dynamic is made up of each individual one of us. And if there's a greater level of integrity that we all bring to our work, I think we will be in a better place, where we won't simply be sort of casting groups, painting with broad brushstrokes, publishers as evil, or whatever the us-them dialogue is of the day. So that's how I hope we come out of this.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, because even an individual is very often playing different opposing roles. I mean, so many editors for journals are authors and researchers themselves, and you can have this sort of, I don't know, split mind of oh, I'm a good guy when I'm editing someone else's work, but oh, those editors when I send something into them. And similarly, you talked about publishing is not monolithic, and one of the central pillars of the research information world has long been the scholarly society. But here too, we're also seeing erosion. The publishing market's really rapidly consolidating down to a small number of big commercial publishing houses, and it's increasingly difficult for an independent scholarly publisher to survive. So Robert, you're with the American Mathematical Society. Can you talk about the struggles that you're seeing for the societies, and whether there's still a role in the community for the Research Society?
Well, that is something that keeps me up at night. You actually asked us to be positive, and I realized, oh no, it's possible. Just given the appropriate amount of single malt, then I'm happy to be positive. But yeah, I mean, we're an old society founded in 1888, and our publishing program is significant, at least it feels like that to us. So we publish around 100 books a year and 25 journals. We have a very successful and prominent database for mathematicians called MathSciNet. About 70% of our revenues as a society come from our publishing operations. So yes, I do. That keeps me up at night. If all of the scenarios that are out there came to be without a sort of a real practical understanding of how to implement those in a sensible way that suits mathematicians, and that money were to evaporate as a society, we would not be able to do all the good things we do. And we do a lot. We have these things called mathematical research communities for early career mathematicians, networking, collaboration, seminars, and so on. We fund travel grants, some of the major prizes in mathematics. I could go on. We have a competition called Who Wants to Be a Mathematician for high schoolers, which is actually remarkably successful and kind of fun to go to. So, I mean, and I hear from funders, and it seems to be a theme, that funders say, well, in the face of Plan S or in the face of read and publish agreements, societies need to come up with another revenue model. So, don't worry about publishing, you need to come up with other revenue models. Well, it's easy to say, and I suspect that, if we were squeezed out of doing all of those good things, our community would suffer. Our 30,000 members certainly would like us to do what we do. At the STM meeting in Frankfurt, it was actually interesting listening to Daniel Ropers, the new CEO of Springer Nature, talk about how we've come to a point where the conversation is no longer rational. You have advocates at all ends of the spectrums that we see, and the point in which we could meet, and it's a bit like our political situation in this country, the points at which we could meet are sometimes, it's just impossible to reach there. And it struck me that actually as Springer Nature or Wiley or any of the big publishers, they work with all of these societies. We're an independent society, but they work with all these societies. And surely societies are a direct bridge, a connection to those research communities. And there's trust that can be built into some of that. I mean, I could go on ad nauseum because I've written a lot of notes, even reminding myself of my name, I see here. But maybe maybe I'll just leave that in case there are any questions that are relevant.
We can come back if there are questions. And so you talked about the sort of almost an insular nature of academia, and particularly academic publishing, of these sort of advocates arguing in a circle with one another. And so, Judy, your answer when I asked you was about, this idea of, well, how do we reach a broader audience? How do we get research out much more broadly to the general public? And is that a solution for building back the trust that the research world seems to be struggling with right now? And can you talk about the sorts of innovation that you're seeing in new ways to broaden the audience for this important information that our researchers are coming out with regularly?
Well, I'm going to echo some of what my colleague said. I watch a variety of news sources, and sometimes I get concerned that there are references made to the type of research being done that take me back to something I haven't heard referenced in many, many years about the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin, and that doesn't give credit to the academy. It doesn't give credit to the work that's being done. But let's face it, the language that the work is written in is highly specialized with good reason, and therefore fairly impenetrable to people outside of the academy. So in some sense, we don't take it on ourselves to promote that content usually. But I think that's changing between large publishers and scholarly societies, and it's changing in a couple of interesting ways. So I'm just going to give you one example, or two today. One is that abstracts are becoming more interesting. Abstracts have traditionally had 3 sentences, this is what we were going to do, this is how we did it, and this is what we found. But even some of those can get very, very dense. An example I saw recently was using P factors, and there were 15 of them in one row. Well, even if you know the field, that's hard to digest. And then people in related fields might be interested, but who has time to read everything there is to read? So content, there are a variety of ways publishers are dealing with this. Some are using 3 bullet points. They're requiring the authors to tell them, don't worry about what your objectives were, how you did it. Tell us what the outcomes were and why that's important. Just give us the punchline. 3 bullet points, and some of them are limiting it to 84 characters, what they think will fit on a screen. Others are doing podcasts to appeal to the younger generation because we don't have time to read. So if you're working out at the gym and you want to hear something that is about your field, you can listen to a podcast. And others, and this isn't brand new, but others have been doing graphical abstracts. That doesn't fit into every field, but it's kind of like a miniature infographic that gives you, in kind of at a glance to somebody who knows that field, in an instant, I get what they were doing and it is or is not relevant to me. Now, to take that a step further, earlier this year, Google Scholar released what they're calling quick abstracts. And it's designed for mobile users, and what it does is stream onto your mobile device a really nice, clear image of the abstract. They'll post whatever type of abstract is available to them. And as you download or you're looking at your Google search results on your screen, you can swipe through them. You find one you like, you can click it and have it deposited in your read later file. I just love this from a standpoint of workflow, because just trying to get through all the things we have to do in a day, we can do it with one click. That's why Amazon has been so successful. So I see this as really helping us with a focus on the core audience, the extended audience, and then when it's written in that plain language, it can be tweeted out, it can be posted on more public sites, and it just makes it that much easier to disseminate.
Okay. Thanks, Judy. So I want to turn now to libraries. So just as, as academic publishers are, we talked about, in danger of losing their place, near the center of the information landscape, so are the libraries. So Lisa, your suggestion of what keeps you up at night is this shift from local support for scholarly activities and workflow to the sort of increasing use of external services and platforms. So I wanted to ask, is that just a natural progression of the digital age? Or is this something libraries should be actively working to counter or at least manage? So your thoughts?
Good, and you didn't introduce this by saying, I love Lisa's writing because I disagree with everything you say. So that's like an improvement. I think he took your message. Lisa Hinchliff at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I particularly mentioned that because one of the things that I've been reflecting on in sort of listening here at Charleston or over the past couple of years is the degree to which sort of the way we conceptualize the community that we serve from a particular institution or organization really shapes some of the things that we think about. And so I'm sometimes wondering if some of what can come out in a sort of confrontational or adversarial way isn't so much sort of intentionally adversarial so much as a centering on different priorities and then disagreement about the correct ends, or the correct means to even the same ends in certain cases. And so one of the things that I think we don't want sort of a papered over sort of when there is disagreement for the sake of sort of presenting, right? We want to actually be able to collaboratively interrogate these differences and these different viewpoints. So one of the things that I've really been thinking about is, and as I was thinking about the way you framed this question, my own thought back to me was the whole question of what is the actual shift that libraries are experiencing? And I think the shift that we're experiencing is this shift from being the provider or the gateway or the holder of content, which we acquired from many of you, right? And then we were the interface, we were the front end, if you will, through the gateway through which you had to come in order to get access to these scarce resources, which are highly valuable. And of course, as these things have gone digital, the wonderful thing, I mean, this is actually success, right? Like, libraries were all set up in order to create access to scarce resources. So now in this digital age, we've never been able to create the kind of access to scarce resources and these really important resources for scholarship like we ever have before. And I'm not a big one for the like never before kind of framing of things, but this is a significant shift between coming to the library, using a paper index. Some of you in the room don't even know about paper indexes. I was being translated into Chinese recently, and the younger librarian who was translating me, I said something about having gone through the era of delivering electronic journals on CD-ROM. And she stopped me and said, I do not know what that word is. So it's an interesting thing how quickly this has really changed. So I think what's moved is rather than centering now on the library as the place, we're really freed up to center ourselves on the user and the needs of that user. So I guess in some ways it's managing this expectation, but particularly we now know that users also experience frustrations that they never experienced before. And that is something where I think we have a lot of common cause. It's really painful as a librarian to know that we have paid lots of money, and that because the systems are impenetrable to people, they're not getting access. They think they actually don't have access to things that we have access to. And last year I was on sabbatical for 9 months. So for 9 months, I did my library research from my home. So I did it from off campus. My poor ER tech department, I filed more tickets pointing out the ways that things were not working. And in fact, there are at least 3 publishers in the room who I ended up with hour-long conversations doing like a personal usability test for you. So like this issue of like, how do we center on the user as opposed to on either or all the institutions that come into play in organizations, I think might be in some ways a bridge to this sort of collaborative notion, not because we need to say, oh, we need to stop hating that awful publisher, but because we're all focused on how does this user have a better experience.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. And for the record, I only disagree with maybe 40 to 50% of what you write. But it's that other 50 to 60% that always really makes me think, which I really appreciate. And one of the things you've written a lot about lately is this question of privacy and how this is really an increasing concern with the growth of digital platforms. Libraries have really, for long, they've been these very stalwart protectors of privacy. And libraries are likely to play, a key role in privacy going forward. And so, Anne, your answer to the question was talking about the sort of balance of trust between users and digital platforms. We hear about the great potential of targeted, relevant services, but those often require the user to disclose an increasing amount of data to feed the algorithm, feed the AI. So can you talk about that sort of dilemma? Do you think those services are worth the loss of privacy that they seem to require?
So another common sub-theme I think that we hear a lot of is the idea of looking at a problem or challenge and trying to come up with a single answer to it, thinking that it's all the same thing. And I think what I've observed personally and professionally is that when you have control over what you give to whom, when, where, and how, and you understand the benefit that you're getting back for it, you don't really have a problem with that. Most people would acknowledge that, you know, the right people having their data can save them time, can save them money, can save them aggravation. But then by the same token, they would also tell you that a lot of their data is floating around. They don't know where it is, what it is, how it was assembled, what it's being used for. And I think that that's really the core issue, is that our ability to process and use data in new and innovative and sometimes scary ways has outpaced our understanding of how to manage it and our technical ability to manage it. So I think one of the things that when I think about what really scares me at night, I just came back from China, and I was looking at some of the neat applications that we were exposed to there. And when you think about the richness of some of these applications, it all had to do with the predominance, the prevalence of available data. Data that honestly people back at home, I had a debate about somebody, even e-commerce, the ability, you know, chips and things like that, and tracking what you've purchased. It would scare them to death, and they would be very unhappy with that. And what scared me is if we don't find a balance, if we don't figure out how to decide what we're willing to let people use in what way, and how we're going to leverage that as, you know, an individual, as a company, as a country, you know, I think we better get used to the fact that we might not have such a rich and flourishing economy in 15 years from now, because someone else will have gotten really good at things that we were too nervous about pursuing for good reason. So I don't want to say that I don't think people's privacy concerns are valid. They are. I have them too. But you know what? My identity was stolen 20 years ago from paper. So that there's always the downside of anything we do, of anything we share. And I just think that we've got to figure out, and I know this is an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do, but we have to figure out how are we going to catch up, or at least get closer to the abilities that people have to use our data. How are we going to get closer to being able to manage and at least have some say in that process? Because I think that's really the problem. It isn't that data can be used in all these different ways. It's that we feel helpless.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, you can look at any challenge as, well, this is the end of the world, or this is an opportunity. And I think that brings us to Joe. So your answer to me was sort of about a different kind of trust. So we're in this era of uncertainty. It's hard to sort out all these different threats and opportunities. And you work with a really wide variety of clients. You work with not-for-profit research societies like the ones Robert talked about. When you're working with someone, how do you help them figure out what to do? I mean, I think there's a level of self-knowledge that whether you're a publisher, or a library, you're a society, that you need to build to make informed decisions. So can you talk about the sort of self-analysis that the different stakeholders in the community can be doing to help them find a path forward?
Yeah, but before I begin, I should note that I'm perilously close to the edge of this. And if I should disappear, I will tell you there is a conspiracy among the chefs at the Scholarly Kitchen. You know, when, as Robert mentioned, when we were going through our preparation for this, David started to get very anxious. There was gloom and doom, and everyone was feeling oppressed. And he said, my gosh, you got to find something positive to say. You know, and everybody's scratching their head. That would be very hard. So in this regard, I've got to, and I can understand that, you know, certainly there are some very difficult circumstances that we have been living under for some time now. But I have to say, I will be making a confession here today, and that my name is Joe Esposito, and I am an optimist. And what keeps me up at night, I can say very easily, it's just that there are so many opportunities out there. It is astounding. And it's hard to sleep because you want to jump out of bed and go after all of these. And the sense of gloom and doom is, to my mind, simply a lack of imagination. And really what we need to do is focus on imagination and innovation and our best qualities and not our worst qualities in order to go forward. And I believe that in my DNA. This is just the way I'm constructed, and I really can't help it. I don't want to belittle the people who are feeling anxious and feeling that there are these issues of trust out there. But I have to say, I really think that's looking at the wrong problem. When we have a political figure who talks about, the failing New York Times, that is not a statement of a lack of trust in authoritative information. It's rather very much the opposite. It's the awareness that that authoritative information is trusted by so many people, it proves a threat to a bully. And in the discussions of fake news or things like climate science denial, what we always hear is the desperate attempts to overturn authority structures that have served us very, very well. So I have to say that rather than thinking about a failure of trust or a decline of trust, I think we should be thinking about a failure of nerve, which is, I think, more really the cultural issue that we're dealing with. So my view is that the key problem we're facing today, and I want to narrow this from a more global discussion into scholarly communications. I think the real issue that we're facing today is the sheer explosion of information and knowledge that is being created. We hear the figure that we're up to 3 million scientific articles a year now. That is an astonishing amount. And what it means is that every day the amount of information just grows and grows and grows. It becomes harder and harder to find what you're looking for. That puts a premium on discovery services. We have all these new tools to help us. I happen to think that it's a little bit like the novel Tristram Shandy, that as you begin to narrate your life, you realize you'll never catch up, that your life keeps going on faster than the narration, and we will not catch up with this knowledge explosion. And that is, I think, a very, very real concern. So where does one go for this? And I would say this, in our work with professional societies, what we say to them is that you have to be aware of the fact that you happen to possess the greatest search engine that's ever been found, and that is you happen to have a reliable brand. You have a name that's associated with particularly important and qualitatively superior information in a particular field. And people go to that brand in order to find that information. The second thing we tell them is that you have to stop thinking of yourselves as publishers. You have to begin to think of yourselves as brand managers. And you have to find opportunities to put this brand on other kinds of high quality information, all of which in fact is a message about the quality of your brand and the authority that you're bringing to this. So I would say if there's something we should not do, and by this I mean not just publishers, but the community at large, is to do anything that undercuts the brands that are associated with quality publication. And we know that there are so many attempts to do that. We recognize, of course, that some people think the journals are not important and they're just accidents, and we talk about editorial boards and the review process as just being rigged situations. But if you work with them, you realize they're not perfect, but they're pretty good. So I think what I would say here on this issue of trust, the real issue here is that I think we have forgotten that all of us do, in fact, put our trust in certain kinds of things, and we go back to them over and over again. The brand is the best search engine that has ever been created. It's far better than Google. And what we encourage societies to do is to have a strategy, is to reinforce the strength of that brand and to extend it.
Thanks, Joe. That's sort of the end of my questions. I think, as you pointed out, it is way easier to tear apart someone else's idea than it is to come up with a positive idea yourself. We're open for questions if you have any, or we're very happy to argue amongst ourselves. Having been out for drinks or dinner with most of these people this week, I can tell you they're very good at it. I'm going to start things off, a question for Lisa, talking about what Anne talked about, privacy, and you've written a lot about privacy. And I often argue with you that, well, the cat's out of the bag already. Every one of your students in your library is signed into Facebook and Google as they're using your library tools, so someone is tracking them already. But you've made a lot of really compelling arguments about, no, we still need to protect that privacy, and the idea that a user should control the information about themselves is, I think, a strong thread of what you've got. And can you talk a little
Yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly, I mean, if you're a librarian, you know that this is an issue that's really roiling through our community of sort of our historic, the way we've understood protecting people's privacy and the role of the library as sort of the gatekeeper to privacy, and then the reality of today's digital age where we might still delete your circulation record, but at the same time, you're going off to third-party platforms all the time, all of which are tracking you. And so, you know, for my own thinking, as David sort of alluded to, and I think Anne was really the strong point she was making here as well, is what is particularly problematic from my perspective is when people's data is being collected and tracked and used in ways that they are not even informed about, or honestly, in some cases, intentionally is kept from them. And so the obscuring of the way that data is being collected, the sort of language that is sometimes put forward that seems very reassuring until you read it. And then I think the other thing that in what you just said, David, sort of brings to the fore, which is, so Facebook is going to tell you their privacy policy, and Google's going to tell you their privacy policy, all of which, by the way, are mislabeled because they should all be labeled data collection and management policies, because absolutely none of them are a privacy policy. But there's no entity responsible for telling you about how being logged into Facebook and Google and a library database is going to affect you, right? It's really the biggest dangers come in the aggregation of your data, not in the individual collection. And so while it's true that in China we see great app development, we also see that China is implementing, for example, the social score, and that maybe you won't be able to buy a public transportation ticket if you don't have a high enough social score. So these are some very interesting things, right? It's easy for us to look at the positives. It's easy to also tell the scary story, right? Like I just did about not being able to buy the public transportation ticket. I think the issues are much more challenging when we actually don't know how reality is being shaped for us. And SSP, our sponsor, also sponsored a pre-conference at this event. And we had a panelist of researchers. And it was very interesting because I'm going to share, they started, when they were asked about privacy, they said, well, I assume I don't have any privacy. And so they said, particularly since they work for a state institution. And I work for a state institution. Any of you can FOIA my email. You can see what my salary is, right? Like, so there's a degree to which it's absolutely the case. But I then posed to them, if you could actually roll that back, would you want to? And they both were like, yes, absolutely. So acknowledging that your privacy has essentially been taken away from you does not mean you like it. And so I think that's the other question, which is what would it look like? Because I agree with David, it's kind of gone. So if we wanted to roll it back, what would that look like? And I don't think we have a good answer for that. I can say that I do have a grant with a couple people at Montana State University where we're trying to have this kind of conversation. And if you happen to be coming to the Coalition for Networked Information Conference in December, we'll be actually looking at questions of what would library license language look like if the publisher community and library community could agree on how data was going to be collected and used in ways that librarians could say, yes, we can feel good about this from our privacy protecting standpoint, and publishers could feel good about in the sense of it allowing that kind of innovative platform development that honestly our users want. So it'll be interesting to see if we can come up with something.
I was actually going to just make one little comment about your horror story on the social score. So I probably spoke to at least 50 different people, not a representative random sample at all, in China, with horror about this whole idea of a social score. 48 of them thought it was a great idea. And the reason they thought it was a great idea was because the firm belief that it would only benefit them, that it might have a problem for other people, but it wouldn't be a problem for them. And now we can chuckle and say, well, that's really naive. And that may very well be naive, but I bet you there will be people for whom it's a very positive thing. So the problem with it, the problem is arbitrary analysis and use by a government of their data in ways that they are not given permission for, in ways that they are not given the option to get into or get out of. It's being forced on them. And I get really, really scared when we are, this is probably, don't tweet this, but when, no, I get really nervous. No, I get really nervous when we are a little bit of data prudes, quite frankly. Like, I think that there is some value in sharing data, and there are many horror stories, and we need, I actually agree with you. We need to be able to manage it. We need to be able to take more ownership. People need to be accountable. There needs to be some regulation around how people can use data. But we can't just be afraid of the data itself, or we're going to find ourselves really far behind in this world.
Yeah, I think we actually quite a bit, like 90% agree here. So,
But you both talked about this idea of invisible forces, whether that's, the social score. Well, how does that work exactly? And, in the world of scholarly communications, we're really turning towards AI as being a part of both, how do I, algorithms and such, how do I find material, how do I discover material, as well as they're creeping into the peer review process of, you're sending in your article to us, we're going to run it through our AI and see what it thinks of that. These are, to most of us at least, sort of black boxes. What does that do for, we know they can be biased, we know they can be gamed. What does that do for this idea of trust? Is this something we need to be concerned about, or are there ways we can be transparent with this and clarify?
Yeah, can I give a shout out for transparency? This was, Alice and I had a chance to chat a bit last week ahead of this event, and we said, okay, but we have to be positive. And one of the surefire things that we came up with was transparency. I think it earns quite a bit of trust to label privacy policies correctly as data management policies, but specifically for organizations to be very upfront about, this is our process, this is our mission, this is how we're getting it done. And it comes back to that individual integrity piece. If each of us were, every day getting up and doing our best and being willing to share exactly what's going on in our organizations, then there's no reason to be ruled by fear. And I really liked what Joe said as well, as far as the kind of crisis of nerve or the lack of nerve. And there really is something to that. It takes some bravery to be able to say, yeah, here's my messy reality. Here's the transparent reality of how I do what I do.
I just want to make one comment on what Letty was saying real fast. So one of the things that we do in my organization is we pull together a lot of data from disparate sources. We do surveys and pulling together data to size and do lots of interesting things with the open access market. What astounds me is that publishers really don't like to share their data. And it's very difficult for us to get a handle on what's going on, when if it was all shared, it would benefit everybody, and anonymized or whatnot. It would, and I know there's talk about the Metadata 2020 initiative, and the fact that our data is so poorly prepared. We don't have an OA indicator at the article level, so people guess what hybrid is and what isn't, just based on what the license is and where it was published and whatnot. So just the idea of getting better data quality, I know it's a little bit of and being brave enough to share it in an anonymous fashion, I think it's really important. So we all kind of understand where we are and where things are going.
All right.
But that goes back to transparency again, doesn't it? You want transparent metadata on top of everything else. And I just wanted to add to Letty's point, really, that and to go back to your original question, which was about AI. Transparency is the answer for AI. I mean, I know never in a million years is Google going to tell us how their algorithms work, but wouldn't that be great? Because then we would understand why when you type in Hitler was, you get whatever it is, horrible stuff that you get. And then we could all help, hopefully, make search results better. If we knew what, there's that awful story, isn't there, about Amazon, I think, using AI to screen job applications, and basically it was a sort of self-reinforcing, only ever hire men algorithm. I mean, this is terrible, but if it's transparent, at least you can see it and you can fix it.
Yeah. Let me throw it on Joe. Both, everyone here just mentioned this idea of nerve that you brought up, and one of the things that's sort of fascinating when you see the different sort of publishers get together in these industry groups and through these informational projects like Anron's is this: nobody wants to disclose any information about what they do, because there's this fear that runs through most organizations that if I tell you what I'm spending to run the air conditioner in my building, Elsevier is somehow going to use that and do something. I mean, with no actual, idea of what that means, but it's almost this fear-driven of I don't dare, let my secrets out of the bag because it's going to destroy me. And is that how do you know where you can be open and transparent, Joe?
I'd like to address this from a slightly different angle. So we were talking about this incredibly scary world of living under surveillance all the time. But I'd like to share an anecdote. When my daughter was in high school, like most kids in the United States, she was asked to read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a novel that I imagine most of the people in this room have read. And after she read the book, she had to write a paper on it. And she wrote the paper and she said, "Dad, would you read my paper and tell me if it's any good?" And I said, "Sure." And I sat down and read the paper and was utterly astonished to find out that, gosh, my little daughter didn't realize that this was a dystopian novel. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, And she's reading through this book, and she said, "My gosh, what a great place to be." And so I was reading this book, I was reading her paper, and I started to reflect. I went back and I read the book again. And I said, this is pretty interesting. She's got a point. I have to say, as her dad, I don't like the sex part too much. But what we realized was that what was dystopian in the 1930s, or I'm not sure just what the date of publication was, didn't really seem quite so scary today. So what I would suggest here is that some of the anxieties that we're expressing here are not going to be solved. They're simply going to be superseded. Just as we once had the philosophical problem of how many angels can dance on the stand on the head of a pin, there is no answer to that question, but we don't ask that question anymore. And I think a lot of the things that are making people feel very troubled today are questions that will resolve themselves in due course, not by being answered, but because we'll move on to another level of question that will engage us at that time.
Robert, last word before we're out of time.
There you go.
Okay, I pushed the button. Just slight twist on this. As a publisher, one of the things, as mathematicians, we've been involved with development of open source tools. So I think actually, as a publisher, you could be right up there at the beginning of the publishing process and start being transparent and sort of provide tools to the community that can be used by others. I'm thinking of things like MathJax, for example, here, and even Tech, which we were at the beginning of. But just thinking about transparency, not just in terms of AI, not just in terms of privacy, however you say it, but in terms of open source tools that you can actually deploy and then share with others. I think that's another way of looking at it.
Right. I think that's we're at a huge moment where that's really becoming increasingly important to the community. I think we're a couple of minutes over, but thanks for your attention, and thanks to the chefs for their opinions.